to some of the reasons why aliens may not have visited us in the past, but if they exist, will probably visit us fairly soon. So, first, I'm Joseph Cadot. As always, you feel free to buy my books. They're lying behind me next to the D&D stuff. The most recent ones is the anthology Fake News about conspiracy theories, with stories written by a variety of authors, and the most recent novel is Job herself, although hopefully something will change on that front within the next 6 months. So, also, as always, feel free to ask questions. Please send me comments, requests, insults. I don't care. Whatever you want me to respond to, I will at this stage, because you're literally going to be the first person to do this. Well, one other person has asked things of me. So you'll be the second person to do some of this stuff and probably the first person to the others. So let's begin. I ended the last segment of this with the point that the ancient aliens theory is derived from a theory that was fundamentally racist, which is that the people who lived in an area couldn't actually have done the work to create all the monoliths and enormous projects and so on that they were supposed to have, and therefore someone else had to come along. And prior to the middle of the 20th century, that was most commonly considered to be white people or other sorts of special people who were acceptable to the European establishment or the Chinese establishment, because they had their own hyper racist conception of what history was like. Like the idea that the printing press was invented in China, which it wasn't. Or clocks were invented in China, which they weren't. Or writing was invented in China, which it absolutely wasn't. I mean, they made improvements just like every other nation and culture that encountered these things did, but they didn't invent this stuff. Nor did white people or their other most popular variants, the Lost 10 Tribes of Israel, come and build the mounds in Cahokia, or establish the Incan Empire, or build the Pueblos, or or found the Iroquois Confederacy, which is weird. That's also assumed to be the Vikings did that too. Neither of those things make sense. So those were theories that were very popular at the time. The issue, of course, is that that's not true, and it's no more true than aliens coming to do those things. And again, you have to ask yourself, why would these people do these things? Well, for reasons, obviously. There's a similar theory, though, that's not racist, surprisingly. And I think a lot of the people who buy into the ancient aliens theory aren't racist intentionally. It's just that that's where the source of the information comes, and therefore it skews that way. Is that there's a theory most reliably proposed in the movie Independence Day, which tells you the quality of this theory, that transistors, the internet, GPS, etc., cell phones, etc., all came from discoveries from the ship that crashed at Roswell, something which I discussed in the first or precursor episode to this current iteration of this thing which I have going. Okay, that's not true. That's completely untrue. And the reason why that's completely untrue is because we have all sorts of documentation as to how these things were developed, and the precursor technology and theory and so on goes back hundreds, if not thousands, of years in some of these cases. Um, you know, so anyway, and you can look throughout history and see again and again this sort of thing where, like with the monuments that people say were built by aliens, these technologies that people say were created by aliens or imparted to us by aliens, they have lots and lots of things that led up to them, which we either have record for or are easily derivable from the records which we have. Um, and you get things like Boolean logic, which is used uh, to create most computer programs that are in quantum systems or in what are known as analog systems, which are good description of analog system is the hydraulic systems which were used in the Roman Empire, just kind of for funsies, by Heron of Alexander. We use analog systems to this day. They're rare because they're more difficult to maintain and program for than digital systems, which use Boolean logic, but they exist. Boolean logic comes straight from the traditions of logic, informed extensively by the work of theologians and philosophers who have, basically written our logical systems, our systems of reason and rationality. And, so this isn't something that just came out of nowhere. Boole was working based on history. As Newton said, if he has seen farther, it's only because he stood on the shoulder of giants. Things like relativity, calculus, Newton's theory of gravity, all of which, quantum theory, all of which seem remarkable, and they are, and required massive leaps, which they did. But that's not to say that other people wouldn't have come up with the same ideas at some point eventually. I pointed out in the previous thing that, there's a lot of roads not traveled technologies and sciences and philosophies which could have occurred much earlier. I use the example of balloons, hot air balloons. Could have occurred much, much earlier than they did. There's no reason why they couldn't have, except that they just simply didn't. So, there's a lot of things that came about because of the general impetus and general thrust of the sciences. And it's not to say that, or to take away anything done by these great people who did the work. But it's to say that there didn't need to be aliens. And in fact, aliens would be a weird insert. It'd be like if you look at the history of evolution of humanity, which is extremely well documented in terms of bones and all sorts of fun DNA, like mitochondrial DNA is a good example of ways which we can trace back humanity hundreds of thousands or millions of years, depending upon what part of what you want to call human and what part of the human being you're looking at. It's like saying that there's some interruption and aliens did something to change this. That was fashionable for a brief time because of a scam that was pulled called Peking Man. But it wasn't true. And in fact, it only worked because this guy faked a skull. And so the same thing is true with a lot of these other things and with all these out-of-place artifacts, that it only works if you don't have enough information. And not having enough information is not problematic morally. And if you strive to get the new information or the appropriate information, there's no issue whatsoever. You recognize, and this is crucial in science and philosophy and theology, you recognize that you are missing information, therefore you strive to acquire it, And then once you have acquired, you change what you have to fit the new information as well as all the old information you have. And you reevaluate all your information to see what's valid. Okay? So, but that's not the whole of the ancient aliens things. That's a legitimate understanding of an ancient aliens thing. And there are people throughout history who've come across artifacts that their culture could not have created. Think of all the barbarians who were moving into Europe from Central Asia, like the Germans, who would come to Roman ruins and see these things which they could not have built, and were astonished by them. And so naturally they would say, how did this happen? Now, they didn't believe aliens did it, because that wasn't really a thing. But, the same basic impetus is there. And that's not a dishonest impetus. However, let's go into exactly why I said this is a racist preconception in a little more depth. Okay, we had the whole thing about how Europeans primarily, but some Asian cultures, would ascribe things to their own culture or some related culture that were made by some other group that was completely unrelated to them. So this got a kick in the pants with the New Age movement. And the New Age movement, which is a very interesting thing to study, especially if you only know what you've seen in media, or people who say they're spiritual, not religious, which is absolute bullshit. There's no such thing. I mean, you're religious, you're just not necessarily part of a religious organization, but you probably have beliefs and dogma which you may have come up with yourself, but that doesn't mean you don't have those things. Anyways. So, the 23-year-old with who's trying to combine yoga with Celtic mythology while she's leading a Bikram yoga class. Oh, by the way, that guy's a predator. But anyways, the New Age comes about because of a specific woman named Madame Blavatsky. That's not her real name, but that's the way she wanted to be known, and that's the way we'll call her, and that's the way she's mostly known throughout history. Blavatsky believed in what's called theosophy, which was a principle she came up with after borrowing from a bunch of other people. Much like how L. Ron Hubbard came up with Scientology after stealing a bunch of stuff from psychology and discredited stuff from psychology. Let me make that clear. Very discredited stuff from psychology. And Jack Parsons, a occultist who worked at Jet Propulsion Laboratory, who actually trained L. Ron in this whole black magic stuff he was working on. That Parsons died in an explosion should not be a surprise to anybody. Anyways, he's interesting. Look him up if you want. Blavatsky came with this idea that there are multiple ages of history. So, in each age, one culture, she called them race. We would now call them ethnicity, but she was actually using an earlier, and I think a little bit more accurate definition of race than we use. Ours is based on arbitrary measurements that make no difference whatsoever. The traditional term for race used in this around the 1600s and before, like all the way back, was ethnicity. So, which is actually measurable as opposed to some nonsense about skin color or nose shape, So her idea was that each culture had a time where they were ascending, dominant, and then descending. Okay, and then roughly non-existent. And sometimes this cycle would repeat itself. And each age, a different set of cultures would be ascendant, dominant, and descending. In our age, she considered what she called Mongol races to be in descent. Those would be the Semitic peoples. This would be Slavs, although she herself was a Slav, so that's kind of confusing. This would be the people who were, let's just say, of Mediterranean extract, short, swarthy people who wear a lot of hair on their bodies. And these were in descent. And so what were coming up was a race of people who she called Aryans, who had been dominant. This is actually kind of where there's some legitimacy, because the Aryan people had been dominant, and she contended they were the source of all Caucasians, which is kind of, but not quite true. Most people of Indo-European descent, which is Caucasians, have some Aryan in them, because they pretty much conquered large chunks of Central Asia, which is where all Caucasians come from anyways. To an extent, that's kind of true. She confused the Aryans with the Harappan civilization, which was before them and was more advanced. They had things like plumbing and sophisticated structures of state. But, you know, it was the 1800s. You know, the fine details of Indian history weren't available to literally anyone at that point, so especially ancient Indian history. So, oh, by the way, Indian history, amazing topic, which we do not cover enough of. I recommend as a starter a book by John Key called History of India, and Keay, excellent book. It really covers a lot of things without the bias from the Indian or Pakistani or Bangladeshi perspectives. So it's actually really quite good. Anyways, so the Aryans who were once prominent, and they were prominent again when Cyrus the Great conquered all of Mesopotamia, because Aryans you may also know by their other name, which is Persians, and they live in a place called Iran, which means land of the Aryans. Rough translation, like extremely rough translation. And so these people were going to become ascended again. She confused those people with pale Northern European H.P. Lovecraft, John W. Campbell types. The sort of guys that, the sort of people that these guys, hyper racists, would go for. They absolutely aren't. I mean, technically, anybody who has Caucasoid blood has some Aryan in them, so I guess kind of they are, but actual Aryans look like Persians and Pakistani people and Indian people and Bangladeshi people, because that's what they are. So, anyways, so her contention was that the old peoples were dying off and the new peoples were arising and would become dominant. This would be usher in what's known as the Age of Aquarius, which I'm sure you've heard from the song, which... Anyways. So, with the Age of Aquarius stuff, this is supposed to happen naturally over time, and it's going to just occur. Okay? No one has to die for this, according to Blavatsky. You know how, like in Marxism, his nonsense utopia, which would be utterly hell for anybody who thought about it for more than 5 seconds, is it's just supposed to naturally occur. The state withers away, and we have, you know, this anarchist utopia that somehow is supposed to last more than a few days, which no anarchy has ever done. So, in any case, I think you can see where the problem lies. Like with Marxism, there are people who want to hurry the problems along, and you may have heard of them. Well, there are a whole host of people who want to hurry the situation along, but you may have heard of the largest group of them, they did all sorts of excavations in Tibet and studying ancient world in India. A lot of archaeology. They call themselves the NSDAP, which we can shorten to National Socialists, which is literally the Nazis, because yes, the Nazis are a direct and logical conclusion from the New Age theory. Okay, because if you want to get the Age of Aquarius going, one of the easiest ways to do it, according to the theories proposed, is to just make sure that none of the mongrel races are still alive. Hey, that makes the Aryans ascendant by default. So, yeah. Now, as I pointed out earlier, this idea ends up getting mixed with aliens, and so now it's not, it's not necessarily ancient knowledge which is somehow superior. Okay, again, not to denigrate ancient peoples, they did the best they could with the tools they have, just like we're doing the best we can with the tools we have, and people will look back at us for being hyper ignorant, which we are, and so not to denigrate ancient people, but the idea that there's somehow some magical ancient wisdom which will grant us super knowledge or the ability to use crystals to heal. That's just absolute bullshit, and there's nothing you can say otherwise. Because there's no evidence otherwise. But, now the same people who think Himalayan salt isn't a horribly bad for the environment and involves slave labor material are saying, well, we're getting mystical visions from aliens, which are also possibly angels, and they created all this ancient stuff, or they're influencing us, or any number of things. And all of this ignores, again, the very important reality that we know who did this stuff. It was us. It wasn't some magical fairy powers. It wasn't an invisible sky wizard. There's no genie granting wishes. I mean, and when I say invisible sky wizard, I'm specifically referring to the conception of the divine, where you wish for something and it comes true. That doesn't happen. You'll find that there's almost no legitimate religion which says if you wish for something, it'll happen. All legitimate religions, and you can tell because of this, say you have to work for what you want, and the divine may assist you if your cause is righteous or moral or ethical, or it depends on the faith. You turned around 7 times every day before you left your house. So there aren't aliens making this stuff happen. There aren't there's not ancient wisdom behind it. There's no secret underground species. There aren't reptoids, if you're a fan of David Icke, which I don't know why anybody would be, who are in control and working these things around. But it's just us, and that's fine. But what if it's not just us at some point in the future? Because we know it's just us now. But what if it's not just, or if it was somebody else, they made literally no visible impact. So we might as well treat it as it's just us. Well, how would that happen? For that, you're going to have to turn in next time. Please send in all your requests, comments, questions, etc. I'll be happy to answer them. And I hope you had a nice time. I'll see you again probably tomorrow with luck if this keeps on working.